you'll never look just like God. You're always a sorry imitation, but do your very best to not ever take away from God's image or opinion from others because of what they saw in you.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam Camp, and I'm your host. And joining me is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Always a privilege, Sam, which I feel completely unworthy.
Oh, stop it, Richard. You'll make me blush. So this week we are going back to the basics, the fundamentals, the principles.
We're not talking football either,
or the Final Four. So last week we looked at just one of those commandments that I think a lot of people have puzzled over and interpreted in various ways, and that was the Sabbath. So I encourage you to go back and check out that episode.
If you haven't stopped and taken a break to do that yet.
Yeah. We'll allow you to do that. But before we dive in, I will mention that we're going to be having one of our coaching workshops coming up here at the end of March, beginning of April, so March 31st, April 2nd. Yeah. That's going to be at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church on the north side of Atlanta. They have a great facility. It's a great place to meet. We've been doing that for a few years now. We do one on the north side and one on the south side. And so if you work with people, as I say, it's a worthwhile investment to come and to learn how to ask better questions, how to work with people to move them onto God's agenda.
Yeah, just the concept of joining God and what He's doing in someone's life. You're not trying to change them. You're trying to just join God and how God is trying to change and help someone, grow someone. That's a pretty exciting thing to do.
Yeah, it certainly is. And we'll leave links to that in the show notes as always. You can find out more at blackabycoaching.org. And so with that, I think we'll start at the top. We sort of jumped in the middle.
We did.
And now we'll start back at number 1 of the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words.
10 words, yeah. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 says, "Then God spoke all these words," and it is interesting. In the Hebrew, I think this is basically referred to as the 10 words, and they're not long. God doesn't take paragraph after paragraph to spell this all out. It's very succinct, just a handful of words. But of course, I like to say, how many words from God do you need before your life has been radically changed? God doesn't have to speak many. He spoke a word and a universe came into being. So when He speaks some words about how to live your life, they're worth listening to and paying attention to. And so He lists 10. Of course, the law, when the Old Testament talked about the law of Moses, it involved more than just the 10 Commandments. God gave a lot of other instructions, but this is the bedrock. And I think as well, as we look at society today, we look at culture today, and you see where society has drifted perhaps from some of the teachings, the law that God laid down for societies. It's no wonder that there's a lot of confusion today. And so and like everything with God, it can seem very simplistic, perhaps, on the surface, but you probe just a little bit and you begin to realize, God meant a lot more than that, and there's a lot more implications there. So the very first commandment is found in verse 3. It says, "Do not have other gods besides me." And of course, this can kind of strike you a little bit funny because, of course, God knows there are no such thing as other gods. He's the only one. Yeah. And so it's like, saying, well, you'll have no other boogeymans in your life, or like you say, well, there's no such thing, or but what God is saying is, well, they don't technically exist as actual beings, as actual gods, but that doesn't mean that they can't be a god to you.
That doesn't stop humans from making other gods.
Yeah, and treating them as other gods. And so if you love something more than you love God, or you are devoted, you're more committed to something else, or perhaps you invest more money in something else that you would not invest in the things of God, then it is a god to you. Even if they don't exist, you're treating it like it is a god. And I've just known many people that it was not very hard to see that, yeah, there is something in their life that they're more loyal to even than to God. They would make great sacrifices. They would spend large amounts of money and time for them, and that they would never do for God. And God is very much aware of that. And so I remember years ago someone that was his wife was threatening to leave him, and her problem was that she claimed that he loved his work more than he loved her, that he gave all of his energy and devotion and attention to his job, but was not at all sensitive to her. And so they actually went to a counselor, and the counselor even said to the man, well, it looks like you've come down to a choice between your job or your wife. And the person ultimately chose his job, and the sad thing was his job was to be a pastor. And so the person literally said, no, I feel that I'm to be a pastor, and I love this job, I love this work, and it's not fair for me to have to stop doing this. And so the man ended up divorced because of that. And so there are times where perhaps your work is so important to you that literally you sacrifice your family, you sacrifice your kids for that. You could even sacrifice your health sometimes. And of course, there's all kinds of hobbies and things that we enjoy doing. It is interesting to me how people can be devoted to sports or recreation, other things. There's a not so humorous joke of a man that posted on social media and said, "Hey friends, I need help. Quite a while ago, I bought 2 tickets to the Super Bowl, the 50-yard line, but as it turns out, that my wedding has been scheduled for the same day, and so I need help to get out of this mess. And if you can help me, let me know." And then he lists the address where the wedding's being held and says, the bride will be the woman in the white dress. And of course, it's meant to be humorous, but sadly, there are people that you kind of wonder, would they not go or change their wedding or perhaps miss a funeral or something else because of a sporting event. And God knows that. And so God says, I've got to be the only God in your life. And of course, when you allow a false God into your life, they give you a false reality, a false set of values. False gods don't hold you accountable for your sin, your shortcoming. We tend to fashion our false gods into gods that agree with us, and they're very lenient when it comes to our shortcomings, and they don't make us do things we don't want to do. And so the problem with a false god in your life is that it gives you perhaps false joys, false sources of satisfaction, and certainly just distorts what's true, and certainly distorts what matters and what doesn't matter. And so God says from the very beginning, if you want your whole life and your business and your family to line up properly the way God intends for it to, then you've got to begin by having a proper view of God and making sure that if all your priorities are going to be right, you have to start with your number one priority, which is put God first. And then it goes on to say, do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow in worship to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's iniquity to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. And so that's quite a long stretch there, Sam. And it begins by saying, don't make any image, basically, of God. Now, that could be an idol of a false God. It could also be an idol of the real God. And certainly that's a very interesting topic for Christians today, because God is spirit, and you can't see a spirit, at least not unless you are a spirit as well. And so God's invisible. And so how do you how do you make an image of something that's invisible? And so whatever image you make of it, it's not going to be true to life because there isn't a physical form that God takes. And so what happens, as with all idols, is it's our own imagination trying to create what we think God would look like if you could see him. And of course, we can't even begin to imagine what the unseen world, what the spirit world is like. And so we're whatever. I mean, you could make 100-foot statue out of pure gold, and you still would have just a sorry substitute for the real thing. Mm-hmm. It would grossly misrepresent God as a cheap trinket compared to what he actually is. And so what God's saying, but then every day, if you looked at this sort of meager imitation of the real thing, you'd begin to think of your God that way. If you made him as a 10-foot statue, you'd start to think of God as a 10-foot God. If you saw him as a man, then you would not recognize that he had any female traits of compassion and care and so on as well. If you made him to look sort of Caucasian, then you'd be wrong again, because God is not Caucasian or African American or anything else. It supersedes all of that. And so God is just saying, don't put me in a box. And we can do that without necessarily having an actual idol, a physical object that looks like God. We can begin just in our own minds to portray God the way we think he would be. And one of the things we talked about last week was the fact that there's a lot of controversy about how do you portray God even in art, because God does delight in art and beauty, and there's all kinds of things that God will focus on with gold or cherubim being embroidered into the veil in the Holy of Holies and things like that. But what God never allows is to portray him. You could portray an angel, you can portray other things, but you're forbidden from creating an image that represents God. And so so the Jews would not do that. And there's a story that when Pompey, the Roman general, arrived in Israel, that he brazenly walked into the temple, and he went right past where only the priest could go, and then into the Holy of Holies where only the high priest could go. And he looked around, and basically there was nothing in there, because ever since the Babylonians, they had taken the Ark of the Covenant and all that out, and so it was just an empty space now, and never been filled again. And so he was like, well, where's the statue? Like, all these temples always have a big statue of their God. How can the Jews make a big deal about this? And you can't even see him, just invisible. But and so that causes us to sort of perhaps have questions about, so when you make a movie about Jesus, or you have a painting of Jesus, or the Sistine Chapel, and you've got pictures of Jesus, or you have a movie like The Passion of the Christ, or a TV series like The Chosen, is that breaking this commandment, making an image, the appearance of God? In that case, a lot of times you could probably make a case to say, well, Jesus actually had skin on. He did have an appearance. You could see him and not die. Whereas the Bible would say God, the Father, no one has seen. And so Jesus might have been sort of the representation of God that was visible, that you could talk to and listen to and see. And so perhaps it's okay then to have an image of him. But there's you don't see really paintings in Sunday school rooms of God the Father. I mean, you might have like a Father Time or something, but that's not really the same as God the Father, the Creator. So, that's sort of a debate too. It's like, and I know some people that just are against that, either against The Chosen or anything else, regardless of what they do in that, just the very concept of portraying Jesus. Of course, again, the moment you portray Jesus, if you make Jesus white, you may have just misrepresented what he actually looked like, or you might
Yeah.
make him 6 feet tall and he might have been 5'8". We don't know.
Well, and I think the greater danger with, not to get bogged down with TV shows and stuff, but when you start portraying Jesus, when an actor portrays Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
you can't help but take creative license.
Yeah.
And so even
Yeah.
in like personality and tone of voice, when
Yeah.
he's, you could quote scripture, but a lot will be dictated by tone of voice
Exactly.
and body language. And so all of these things now then sort of enter your mind the next time you reflect back on
Yeah.
the Sermon on the Mount. You're probably going to remember it closer to how they portrayed it in The Chosen versus what's actually in
Yeah,
Scripture.
and there's pros and cons with that. I think
Yeah.
sometimes it could be helpful, and I like from The Chosen I've seen. I like the fact they give Jesus a sense of humor. I think he had one, but
Yeah.
every time he rebukes someone or again the tone of voice, like how
Yeah.
because the Bible says he was full of grace and truth, and it's really hard to get the right mix of that. When you're speaking truth, sometimes you can not have as much grace and so on. And so anyway, it's an interesting thing, but I think perhaps one of the major takeaways for here would just be, do you have the right vision of who God is? And if God, and typically what happens is we kind of create our own image of God where he's not maybe as holy or awesome as he really is. There's some great passages in the Old Testament where God even asks, it says, will you not tremble at my presence, or will you not tremble at my word? And that's pretty awesome when God says, don't you know who I am? Why are you not trembling? Because at my word as I'm speaking to you. And some people might say, well, I don't picture God that way. I see him as a very loving Heavenly Father, and I don't need to be afraid of him or in awe of him or even reverence him. He's my buddy. He's my best friend, and why would I be afraid of him? And sometimes I think our challenge is that we don't quite have a very accurate biblical view in our mind of who God is. And so and of course, if you have a wrong view of God, then that's going to affect your behavior as well and how you act. And so that's why it's important that you don't somehow lower your vision of God down to something that perhaps makes you comfortable, but it misrepresents who God is. And so just one other one to mention today, and that is, it is interesting that God says, I'm a jealous God. I think we should never read past that one too quickly. Because, and of course, he's not talking about some petty middle school jealousy over someone's boyfriend or something. It's talking about a holy God, a creator who has every right to his people's devotion and loyalty, and he will not stand idly by while people give their hearts to someone else instead of to him. And he says, I'm punishing the children of the father's iniquity to the third and fourth generation, which is, again, a very controversial thing. Does God, if you sin, will he punish your grandkids for that or your great-grandkids? And I don't think that he just arbitrarily, you don't have some sweet little granddaughter that just gets punished because nothing that she did, but just because you were bad. But I think it is a principle that if you live your life without integrity and honesty, there will be repercussions down the generations. That's just a law of humanity, how it works. And so that's why you just have to take sin so seriously, because what God is saying is, you could blow it off. And I've seen this happen a lot. Maybe a husband that breaks his wedding vows and commits adultery and ends up divorced and says, but I'll get through this. I'll get to the other side. But his kids never do. His kids suffer lingering consequences because their parents broke up, and they both said they were Christians and they loved God, but then they're not. But now they're not doing necessarily what the Bible says.
Right.
And so, but then you look at it, says, but verse 6, showing faithful love to 1,000 generations. And so I love that. What he's saying is when you mess up, it can have an effect several generations down. But when you do the right thing, God can smile upon the generations 1,000 generations down. So in other words, the comparison between punishing for 2 or 3 or blessing for 1,000, what it's saying is, look at the heart of God. What does God want to do? Well, he wants to bless your family tree to 1,000 generations. That's his predisposition. And so why wouldn't you want to go with that? And so then just the last one is don't misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. And of course, we know it better probably from the King James, where it says, don't take the name of the Lord in vain. And to take something in vain means to make it empty, to make it valueless, to make it worthless. And so anytime you say something that lowers people's view of God as a result. So of course, that's typically been viewed as don't use profanity, don't swear using God's name in some way. And of course, it's pretty common now, the OMG, that is just so common. We take God's name just as a afterthought.
As an expression.
And we'll shrug our shoulders and say, well, I don't really mean anything by it. That's just what I say when I'm frustrated or whatever. But I think that's exactly what God is focusing on, to say, yeah, you're calling and using my name and not meaning anything by it, not taking it seriously. It's but of course, for the ancient Jew, you wouldn't even say the name of God. You would alter the word somehow just so you didn't actually say God's name. You wouldn't want to write his name down for fear that you might drop that piece of paper and it would get on the dirt, or someone might step on God's name. You revered it, and perhaps that's going further than God intended. But there is that sense of, as a Christian, do you revere his name? Do you love his? Because of course in the Bible, a person's name represents their character, their nature, and so to love the name of God means to love God, to love who he is. And I'll tell you, I've worked in secular settings where people were very foul-mouthed, and there were people that blasphemed the name of God, and it meant nothing to them. Or I've been in locker rooms or been out on playing fields where God's name was taken in vain. And again, I don't know. I'm not saying what you should do about that. You confront people and say, don't blaspheme my God's name. But certainly it ought to bother you, whatever you do about it. Hopefully you don't just become immune to that because you just hear it so often. And so this is, all three of these are, in a sense, God's saying, so be sure you take me seriously. Don't treat me lightly. And especially, I would just say, maybe one, just in terms of taking God's name in vain, it's not just using profanities. It is claiming to be a Christian and then misrepresenting God. Saying that you believe God is all-powerful and then living with fear and worry and anxiety all the time. And so by the way you're living, if you're living fearfully, terrified of all the dangers that you would face, what you're saying to a watching world is, my God's not very powerful. My God's not trustworthy. I say he's powerful, but I live in fear because I don't really believe God will do anything to help me. Or I say God's a provider, but then I live in constant worry that he's not going to provide. And or I say my God is holy, but I have a very unholy mouth and lifestyle in which I just don't take the holiness of God seriously. And in any way that you do that, you're taking his name in vain. You're treating his character as if it's empty, as if it's a lightweight. And God is saying, I care about how you represent me. Of course, the word Christian really just means little Christ. These Christians were little Christs, Christ in miniature. And so we're reflections of Christ. So when people see a Christian, they should see what Christ is like. And Jesus knows that. And so God is saying, reflect well, represent me well. Don't, and of course, so many over the years, like people like Gandhi said, I'm pretty impressed with Jesus. I'm not so sure about his followers.
Yeah.
His followers don't represent him well. And I think this is in part what this commandment is about, is saying, you'll never look just like God. You're always a sorry imitation, but do your very best to not ever take away from God's image or opinion from others because of what they saw in you. And so all of this has a lot of application, certainly for us as leaders, because I think as leaders we're put on a stage, whether you're leading a family of children, whether you're a pastor, whether you run a business, whether you're in management, the way that you conduct yourself ought to reflect well on God. The words you speak and just the way you live ought to be a clear indication. They must really serve a loving God. They must serve a holy God. They must serve a God that they fear in a holy, reverent kind of way, because they know they'll give an account to him for how they treat their employees, how they treat others, how well they follow God's commands. And so these first three commandments, we've talked about them. They're vertical. They're talking about your walk, your relationship to God, and then it's going to shift out and start looking at our relationship to others. But God always knows to begin by looking at our walk with him. And once we have got that in place, then our relationships with others will be as they ought to be as well.
Yeah, well, it's always a good reminder. They can seem like simple and old-fashioned 10 Commandments, but they're actually incredibly profound and have a huge impact on how we live today.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.